Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to talk about the best books of 24, but not according to me, but according to other booktubers, and in particular the books that other booktubers have spoken about that have made their way onto my TBR. I always really enjoy watching Scott over at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot go through the different book recommendations that he took from other booktubers, and Scott will very quickly be able to read like 20 different books recommended by other booktubers by around February time. And unfortunately, I don't have that kind of reading stamina. I'm not that speedy on it, and I am very much a mood reader. I like to take my time. So that's not the video that I'm doing for you today. Today, I am just going to talk about the books which I have been intrigued to pick up the most from watching lots of different booktubers' best books of the year for 2024. So without much further ado, let's just get straight into these book recommendations and the booktubers who recommended them. First up, a non-fiction recommendation that I got from Bob the Booker's channel, particularly his video talking about his non-fiction favourites of 2024, was My Good Bright Wolf by Sarah Moss. Sarah Moss is a really popular author on BookTube, but I've only actually read one book by her, which is Ghost Wall, and so I wasn't expecting to be so intrigued by her memoir, but when Bob talked about it, I just thought, yeah, this is one I definitely need to pick up, which takes the form of a conversation between two versions of herself. Her regular self, who is just trying to get her work done, and the wolf of the title, the more negative aspect to her personality that is derailing her, criticising her. This little devil on her shoulder who just keeps on trying to sabotage her. It's meant to be a really incisive memoir on mental health, on eating disorders, societal pressures particularly placed on women. Bob described it as a rallying call for greater understanding, particularly when it comes to issues of mental health. Another non-fiction favourite of the year came from Olive over at A Book Olive, and her favourite non-fiction work of the year was The Joy of Movement: How Exercise Helps Us Find Happiness, Hope, Connection and Courage by Kelly McGonigal. This was a really personal pick for Olive, as she's recently shared her success with weight loss, and particularly the role that exercise has played in making her feel like more at one with her body and just more joyful in her body. This book is not just about the good that exercise does, but Olive talks about how it really captures this feeling of falling in love with exercise and with movement, taking something that Olive said that she had found to be quite a solitary activity and making it feel communal, making it feel like she was a part of something. I have previously mentioned that I've been on my own little weight loss, exercise, fitness journey. My main focus of 2024 was really on just losing the weight, but this year I really want to make more of a priority on exercise and just generally building up my fitness, because I do think it'll be a little bit easy to do, and I really want to have this feeling of falling in love with exercise. There are definitely some fitness classes that I've taken that I really enjoy, but I do want to make this more of a proper habit than just a thing to check off the to-do list. Sarah from Freshly Read Books recommended The Ministry of Time by Kaliane Bradley. This is one that I know was really popular last year, but I'd kind of just given a pass to because it was science fiction, but I do think the premise is really intriguing of what would happen if we had access to time travel and were able to bring people from the past back to our present. This book particularly focuses on bringing people from the past into the present just at the point of their death, so it wouldn't actually affect too much in the past. The way that Sarah was talking about it, how it really explores the implications that this could have, and this discussion of being part of something much larger than you are and not fully knowing the ramifications of what you are doing. She said that it was really accessible and had a real human side to the story. A top book of the year that I just couldn't ignore, because not only was it on Ben Reed's Goods channel, but also Miranda over at Pages and Stages, is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Taking place in ancient Sicily during the course of the Peloponnesian War, it's these Syracusan officers who basically force the Athenian prisoners to perform a production of Medea. It's meant to be really darkly humorous, unusual in the sense that it's using a lot of Irish dialect and slang. I really enjoyed what Ben said about it, that it shows glimmers of beauty and art in the context of deep sadness and deprivation. I believe it won the 2024 Waterstones debut book of the year, so it's been praised here, there and everywhere. One that has been kind of like tentatively on my TBR for a while, but I definitely needed the push off somebody's best books of the year to put it back on my radar, was Dreaming the Eagle by Manda Scott, and this was recommended twice over by Sarah over at Your True Shelf, as well as Aaron at Aaron Read a Book, who coincidentally were buddy reading this book this year, clearly to great success. This is looking at the early life of Boudica, from her first kill at age 12 through to her adulthood. I believe that this particular book stops just as the Romans are invading Britain, but it is the first book in a quartet, so I'm sure we'll see much more of her story play out. Sarah and Aaron particularly noted how evocative it was, how very well paced it was, particularly for them doing a buddy reading through chapters a day, and beautiful beautifully written, so definitely one that I need to make time for, especially because I am so keen to read Boudicca's Daughter by Elodie Harper later this year. Maybe I do need to go back to this classic. Another historical fiction that I definitely need to check out is Katherine by Anya Seton. This was recommended by Shelley Swearingen, which is telling the story of Catherine Swindon, who was mistress and later wife to John of Gaunt. So we are placing ourselves in 14th century England. Shelley compared this to Jane Eyre in that you're getting a childhood to adulthood look at somebody's life, at a young unassuming girl who'd go on to do great things. But she particularly loved how you get to age with Catherine and see how she changes through the course of the book, as well as having this really gripping, passionate love story at the heart of it. Next up, another double recommendation coming from Brian over at Bookish, as well as Tabby and her books, is Soldier Sailor by Claire Killroy. This was one that was really popular last year. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. I didn't really read any of the Women's Prize last year, but this was definitely the one that I came closest to picking up, looking at the realities of early motherhood and particularly the emotional turmoil of feeling completely alone in this new state. This main character having a particularly neglectful husband who doesn't seem to care so much about actually doing his job as a father and the emotional ramifications of that. And yeah, getting this recommendation twofold, first from Brian, for whom the emotional resonance hit him as a father who this year has seen his daughter go through early motherhood, as well as in Tabby, who is now a new mother herself to a little boy. She said it is a breathtaking expression of a mother's love. She read a particular passage from the first few pages, which really just took my breath away. And I'm saying this as somebody who isn't a parent, so I don't know truly what that feels like. And yet that little passage that she read out really got to me. A really unexpected non-fiction recommendation came from Jen the librarian. She recommended a lot of great books, but none really got me quite so intrigued as Nuclear War, a scenario by Annie Jacobsen. And who'd have thought that this would be a book that would appeal to me? But I think the fact that it also wasn't really much of a Jen book, and yet she got really wrapped up in it. This is meant to be a minute by minute account of what would play out should the powers that be decide to declare nuclear war on another country. So obviously this is very speculative, but it's driven by extensive research. While it is non-fiction, Jen said that it is gripping as a thriller would be. And yeah, maybe this is something that I do need to check out and read something that, yes, is going to terrify me, but I probably should know. I actually have two recommendations that came from Greg and Joel over at Supposedly Fun, but I think that's okay because it was two separate lists of 10, and I believe that both of these books were recommended by both Greg and Joel. So, you know, I think it counts, it has to. The first of those being Mrs. Quinn's Rise to Fame by Olivia Ford, which sees 77-year-old Mrs. Quinn, who is pretty long-suffering, pretty quiet woman who's always been kind of shunted to the sidelines, end up going on a Great British Bake Off-like show and discovering newfound independence and actually getting to come more into herself, but also getting to see glimpses of her past. Greg and Joel said it is very reminiscent to something like Slumdog Millionaire, where somebody will mention something and then that will throw us back into the past and we see why that thing was particularly relevant to Mrs. Quinn. It just sounded really sweet and wholesome, and yeah, I'd love to read this. On a more literary track is Small Joys by Elvin James Mensah, which is meant to be this really uplifting, heartwarming story. Even though it is dealing with really hard topics of mental health and depression, we have our main character who is really suffering, feeling incredibly low and even suicidal, but then he ends up meeting Muddy, who is meant to be just a joy of a character, who gives him great support and kindness and just makes him want to live again. And I think a book that is about community and about kindness is definitely something that we need in 2025. On a very, very similar track, coming from Lena Norms, was the recommendation of The Wedding People by Alison Espach. This is following the main character of Phoebe, who checks in at a beautiful hotel with the intention of ending her life. However, what Phoebe didn't bargain for was the fact that this hotel was going to be almost completely overrun by a wedding party. And when Phoebe accidentally lets slip to the bride Leela her intentions of what she's going to be doing this weekend, the bride is like, absolutely not. You can't kill yourself today because you need to help me plan this wedding. And so Phoebe ends up being dragged around here, there and everywhere, with Leela constantly being like, no, you have to do this thing, you have to do this thing. And once again, like with Small Things, slowly through the course of the book, Phoebe is, through making friends with this community, this wedding party, is actually wanting to live again. And then the final book that I'm going to talk about today is one that, yes, everybody had this on their best books of 2024. So really, I could mention so many people who recommended this, but really, the person who I need to give credit to is Melinda over at Web of Stories, because she is the first person to talk about this book that actually made me think, yes, I could read this now, rather than putting it off. And that book is James by Percival Everett. Yes, everyone has read this, everybody has raved about it, so why haven't I picked it up yet? Why did I not have the incentive to? Well, it's because I haven't read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and so I just presume that no matter how lauded James by Percival Everett is, that I couldn't read it until I'd read Huck Finn. But I really feel like Melinda was the first person who was like, no, you don't actually need to read that book in order to enjoy this one. You can get just as much out of it without having that prior context. So yes, this is a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, but through the perspective of Jim, or as he is named in this book, James. And we are getting a more fully formed view of racism in the antebellum South in the early 19th century, the expectations that white people will have of James and the way that he should behave, this conversation around code switching, and how James is really putting on an act and hiding his true self, because if people knew how intelligent he was, they would feel threatened. Apparently the ending is meant to be quite controversial to this one, and not knowing anything about Huck Finn really, I don't know. But yeah, thank you to Melinda for making me feel like actually I can read this book. It's not that I don't want to read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I'm sure I will, but now I feel like it doesn't mean that I can't read this great book as well. So there we go, there is a little list of books that have been recently added to my TBR as a result of all of the fantastic best books of 2024 that I have watched. And this is not an exhaustive list of all of those videos that I have watched, just the ones where they had book recommendations that really spoke to me. Do let me know if any of these books appeared on your best books of the year. Are there any that you are keen to check out now? I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.